In video 1, we covered the descendants of King Gorm, starting with Gorm the Old himself, going on to his son Harold Bluetooth, who converted Denmark to Christianity, and finishing with Sweyn Forkbeard, who eventually became King of England before dying in 1014. If you found that all hard to follow, well, things get even more tricky now when we get to Harold II, the son of Sweyn Forkbeard and Sweyn's successor. The confusion begins, of course, because we now have two Harolds in our discussion of the late Viking Age, Harold Bluetooth and Harold's grandson, and Sweyn Forkbeard's son, Harold II. The confusion can be compounded, of course, because Harold II's reign is not especially noteworthy relative to his father's or the reign of his brothers, Knut the Great, who was Harold's successor after Harold died in 1018. The death of Sweyn Forkbeard in 1014 left his son Harold II as the successor king of Denmark, while Sweyn's other son, 18-year-old Knut, also known as Canute, took charge of Sweyn's military forces in England. Knut fled England, however, and England's former king Ethelred, who Sweyn had overtaken, returned to England to rule once again as monarch. Ethelred would die in 1016, however. His son Edmund Ironside, aka Edmund II, would succeed him and not endure as king. Knut the Great returned. His forces fought Edmund Ironsides to something of a stalemate that resulted in Edmund and Knut sharing power in England. This wouldn't last long, as Edmund would die in November of that year, 1016, and Knut would take the throne as king of all England. Again, this is 2 years before he would also succeed his brother Harold II as king of Denmark. One interesting development of Knut's reign. Remember Thorkel the Tall? He originally allied with Sweyn Forkbeard, Knut's dad, before defecting to support Ethelred against Sweyn. Well, Thorkel the Tall practically became Knut's right-hand man in England, putting him back on the same side as Denmark. Thorkel was put in charge of East Anglia from 1017 until 1021. Suddenly in 1021, Thorkel was, to quote historian Gwyn Jones, outlawed, end quote. He was back out of the good graces. Some kind of reconciliation apparently then took place in 1013, which made Thorkel a regent in Denmark and guardian of Knut's son. After this, Thorkel, quote, disappears from history, end quote, quoting Gwyn Jones again. Upon the death of Sweyn Forkbeard, some of the empire Sweyn had established in Scandinavia crumbled under the oversight of his son Harold II. Danish influence in Sweden dwindled, while loyal allies of Sweyn and Norway were evicted from power to make way for another Olaf, Olaf Haraldsson. More on him later. Knut established himself as a powerful and respected king in England. He embraced the institution of the church, making a pilgrimage to Rome. He was highly regarded as a lawmaker. Knut's legal code, quote, gives him a high place among the legislators of the Dark Ages, end quote, says Sir Frank Stenton in his book Anglo-Saxon England. All accounts of Knut as King of England relate a king of significant stature. More tenuous was Knut's grip on his father's empire in Scandinavia. Danish influence in Norway was challenged by the rise of Olaf Haraldsson to power. Norway under Olaf Haraldsson and Sweden under Eyvind Jacob united to threaten some of the Scandinavian land under Knut's rule. This occurred around 1026. Knut had to leave England to attend to the conflict. Outcomes of the conflict are not entirely clear, but it appears Knut retained most of his dominion. Contemporary poetry, of which we should be skeptical, declared Knut a victor in this conflict. Knut even referred to himself as King of England, King of Denmark, King of Norway, and King of part of Sweden after this conflict. Apparently, how true the self-designation was is open to some dispute, but not complete dispute. Knut was in a very high position of power. Knut later maneuvered to undermine Olaf Haraldsson's rule in Norway. The maneuvering was mostly political, not battles. Knut attempted to gain the support of many powerful chieftains in Norway and apparently succeeded. Olaf was expelled as king in 1028. Olaf Haraldsson would attempt to return in 1030, but would die in battle. Knut the Great left behind an impressive empire when he died in 1035. Knut's son Hardenut was his rightful heir in both England and Denmark. Hardenut succeeded Knut in Denmark, but was unable to immediately claim the throne in England due to a conflict with the King of Norway. Instead, Knut the Great's other son Harald Harefoot ascended to the throne in England. Harald Harefoot, of course, gives us a third Harald in our review of the late Viking Age. Unfortunately, Harald Harefoot is not long for this story. He would die in 1040 when Hardenut would finally be able to come and claim the throne of England. Hardenut's death in 1042 threw the power balance in Scandinavia and England into disarray. He was succeeded in the English throne by an Englishman, Edward the Confessor, the son of former King Ethelred. Meanwhile, in Denmark, he was succeeded by Magnus, who was then serving as the King of Norway. The stage is now set for the man often considered to be the last great Viking. See if you can follow this. Harald Hardrada was Magnus's uncle, apparently a respected uncle because in 1045 Magnus agreed to share power in Norway with Harald. When Hardenut had died, Sweyn Estridsson, son of Knut the Great, claimed the Danish throne, but Danes largely recognized Magnus as their king. When Magnus died in 1047, Harald Hardrada took full power in Norway, Sweyn took full power in Denmark, and a feud of almost 20 years between the two of them ensued. First, I must correct myself. Sweyn Estridsson, the new king of Denmark, was Knut the Great's nephew, not his son, even though Knut did have a son named Sweyn too. I told you, this stuff gets tricky. Anyway, for almost 20 years, Sweyn Estridsson and Harald Hardrada made war on each other, each apparently seeking to claim power over the other's land. Thousands died, towns were destroyed, including, somewhat symbolically, the town of Hedeby in Denmark, which for centuries during the Viking Age had been a bustling commercial center. Harald Hardrada burned it wholesale in 1050. Hardrada, a name which incidentally can be translated as ruthless, lived up to the title of land waster, the term proudly displayed on a banner under which he fought. Thunderbolt of the North. That is the term Adam of Bremen, a chronicler from the 11th century, used to describe Harald Hardrada. After almost 20 years of war, though, the Thunderbolt could not subdue Sweyn Estridsson, and in 1064 the two agreed to peace, neither gaining control over an inch of the other's land. After the Peace of 1064, it would be less than 2 years before another great opportunity for plunder and conquer for Harald Hardrada would come along. Edward the Confessor, the King of England, had died in 1066, and Harold Godwinson succeeded him. Of course, Harald Hardrada considered this an opportunity for him to stake a claim to England. Harald Hardrada allied with King Harold Godwinson's exiled brother Tostig, a former Earl of Northumbria. They also allied with the Earl of Orkney. This alliance amassed 300 ships that sailed to England and managed to do so without the knowledge of Harold Godwinson, who was taken completely by surprise and had to scramble a force to go meet his invaders in short time. In September of 1066, King Godwinson's forces met those of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, 12 kilometers outside of York. The bloodshed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge was of historic proportions. Harald Hardrada's force, amassed and arrived with such impressive stealth, was routed by Harold Godwinson's hastily assembled defenders of England. It required 300 ships to bring Harald Hardrada's men to England. It required only 24 to bring the injured home. Harald Hardrada was among the dead. With the death of Harald Hardrada in 1066, the man known as the last great Viking was dead. So this was the middle of the 11th century, and this is about the time that historians consider the end of the Viking era. Now what's interesting, one thing that's interesting to me is that England would, that same year, 1066, be invaded by William the Conqueror of Normandy. And Normandy is, the name Normandy, that derives from the term Nordman, or Northman, referring to Scandinavia. So William the Conqueror was coming from a land named for the Norsemen, or essentially the Vikings. And yet this happens at a time when the Viking era is said to have, is generally considered to have ended. The Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, were all now Christianized. They were done with their pagan days, their pagan religions. There would be no further conquests and plunder of England like we saw from Sweyn, Forkbeard, and Knut the Great. Those two had succeeded, of course, in England, where Harold Hardrada failed. There would be a few subsequent attempts from Scandinavian rulers to conquer England, not really to any success. So England was not being conquered. The pagan religion was replaced by Christianity. The Viking era was over. And yet, obviously, some kind of legacy from the era endured. We never even talked in my videos about Iceland or Greenland, where Vikings had come and taken over, and their descendants, to my knowledge, still probably live there. Obviously the era left a legacy. So there's just so much more to talk about, so many more people to explore. I could do a recap. Time just doesn't really permit at this point. I'm out of time on this for now. So that's the end. I hope I did this because in reading through Viking history, I just struggled keeping track of who was who. And so I made that a project of mine to try to put something out there that might help clarify who exactly is who in the late Viking Age. I hope it helped. See ya.